Hello, I'm Dr. David Clark. I lecture in historical theology at the University of Roehampton in London. Over the past several weeks, I've been working on a series of video tutorials exploring the risks and the benefits of using AI in biblical and theological research. In this episode, I want to demonstrate how an AI tool such as ChatGPT can be enormously helpful in doing deep biblical research. And to demonstrate this, we're going to look at the example of the book of Ecclesiastes, which is also known as Kohelet. We want to know who wrote this book, and we're going to use ChatGPT to help us investigate that question. Now, the book of Ecclesiastes, or Kohelet as I will be calling it, is generally attributed to King Solomon. The book begins with the statement, "The words of Kohelet, son of David, king in Jerusalem." But anyone who has ever studied ancient literature knows that in many instances we find texts that claim to have someone as their author, when in fact that person did not write the book. So we have, for example, the case of Enoch, which is part of the Old Testament pseudepigrapha. Nobody really believes that the character Enoch, who is mentioned in the book of Genesis, wrote this text. In the New Testament era, we have a book called the Gospel of Thomas, but nobody really thinks that this text was written by Thomas, the follower of Jesus. So just because this book claims that Solomon is the author doesn't mean that the historical person of Solomon actually wrote it. We have to do a deeper level of research, and that is where we're going to use ChatGPT as our study assistant. So today we're going to look at three questions. The first is a general question: what is the debate around the authorship of Kohelet? The second question is, how can linguistic analysis help me determine who the author was? And the third question is, if it does become apparent that Kohelet was not actually written by Solomon, does that mean that the person who did write it was trying to deceive his readers? Is it a forgery? So let's begin with the first question. We need a general orientation. And so I go to ChatGPT and I write, give me a 300-word summary of the debate around the authorship of Kohelet. And so what ChatGPT explained to me is that the main debate is around the question of language. The main argument against Solomonic authorship is the language in which Kohelet was written. Kohelet reflects a style of writing that was common in the 3rd or the 4th century before Christ, and Solomon lived in the 10th century before Christ. In the book of Kohelet, we see several Aramisms, which indicate an influence from the Aramaic language. We also see many Persian and perhaps even some Greek loanwords. So the linguistic style lines up with the Hebrew writing of the 3rd or 4th century BC and not the 10th century before Christ. Okay, so our first question was, why is there a debate in the first place? And what we found is that this debate exists because of the linguistic style in which Kohelet is written. Now, we then need to do deeper research. And this then leads us to our second question: how can linguistic analysis help determine when a text was written? Now, I've mentioned one of the reasons that scholars are locating Kohelet in the 3rd or the 4th century before Christ is the presence of Aramisms in the text. But the problem for somebody like me is my Hebrew isn't good enough to discern the presence of Aramisms. And so in a way, I'm just dependent on what these scholars say. Now, this is where a tool like ChatGPT can be really helpful, because ChatGPT knows Aramaic, ChatGPT knows Hebrew, and it can give me a really clear picture of where these Aramisms appear. So I went on to ChatGPT and I typed in, give me 5 examples of Aramisms in Kohelet. And this is what it gave me. So what we see here are several verses in which expressions are found that reflect Aramaic influence and which do not line up with earlier forms of biblical Hebrew. Then ChatGPT asked me, would you like me to explain how scholars tell whether a form is an Aramism rather than just late Hebrew? And so I responded, sure. And this is what ChatGPT told me, and I'm going to kind of unpack this because I found it really helpful. In the first case, it gave me examples of words that are found in Kohelet that never appear in early Hebrew. So these are words that didn't exist when early Hebrew was being written. Now we have examples of this in English. Think about the word computer. 500 years ago, the word computer did not exist in the English language, but it does exist today. It also showed me how morphology or word form can be a clue to the date in which a text was written. There are words in Kohelet that are spelled in a way that is different than the spelling of early biblical Hebrew. And this again also happens in English. So for example, we have the word busy, B-U-S-Y, but 500 years ago, this word was spelled B-I-S-I-E. So when you come across the spelling of a word, that gives you a clue around when this text was written. And in the case of Kohelet, the spelling often indicates that this text was written at a later date. ChatGPT also showed me how syntax, which involves word order and morphology, also reflected a late date for the writing of Kohelet. So I'll give you another example from English. In Shakespeare's Hamlet, we find the expression, "I know not what you mean." Okay, that's how people talked during Shakespeare's time. But today we say, "I do not know what you mean." Syntax, the way we form sentences, has changed. And the same happens in Hebrew, and that is often a clue as to when a text was written. And one final example that ChatGPT gave me is how sometimes the meaning of the same word changes over time. So there are words in Kohelet where we can see that the meaning ascribed to this word is very different than what that same word meant in earlier forms of Hebrew. We have the word silly. 500 years ago, silly meant blessed, innocent, or deserving pity. So you might find, for example, a silly soul, which was an innocent or a pitiable person. But of course, today, silly means foolish, lacking in seriousness, playfulness. So the word silly doesn't mean today what it meant 500 years ago. And we also find examples in Kohelet where we can tell by the context of a certain word that its meaning is different than what that same word had meant in earlier forms of biblical Hebrew. So all of these examples seem to reinforce the argument that Kohelet is not written in a style of Hebrew that reflects the Hebrew of King Solomon's day, the 10th century BC, but rather that Kohelet is written in a style of Hebrew that corresponds to the 3rd or the 4th century before Christ. But let's not stop there. Sure, the version of Kohelet that we have is written in this late Hebrew style, but how do we know that earlier forms of Kohelet didn't exist? Maybe out there somewhere is an ancient Hebrew version of Kohelet that has simply been lost. Could it be that there is this older version somewhere out there, and it so happens that we only have this updated version, and so we think that Kohelet corresponds to the 3rd or 4th century before Christ, when in fact, maybe it really is from the time of Solomon. So let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Shakespeare wrote Hamlet right around the year 1600, and the language of Hamlet really reflects that older form of English. I'll give you an example. "Oh, that this too solid flesh would melt, thaw and resolve itself into a dew. Oh, that the everlasting had not fixed his canon 'gainst self-slaughter, O God, O God." So here's that same text in a translation called No Sweat Shakespeare. It reads, "I wish my flesh would just melt away, turn to water and disappear. Oh, that God hadn't made a law against suicide, oh God, oh God." So what would happen if all the oldest versions of Hamlet were lost? And let's imagine that 500 years from now, the only available version of Hamlet was this translation from No Sweat Shakespeare. Some scholars in that future time might argue that Hamlet was written in the 20th century because that's the style of language that they're seeing. So is it possible that the same thing happened with Kohelet? Well, I went and I asked ChatGPT. I typed in the case of Kohelet, is it possible that the original text was written in an early form of Hebrew corresponding to the time of Solomon, and that the Aramisms reflect later updates or adaptations? So here's an overview of the answer that ChatGPT gave me. Technically, it's possible in principle, but there is no evidence that this is in fact what has occurred. So I want to know, well, what kind of evidence would we expect to see? When it happens that there is an earlier version of a text that has been updated, what we usually find is that there is a traceable history of revisions. Now, sometimes, even in the Bible, we can find examples of a history of adaptation. I asked ChatGPT to give me some examples, and this is what it showed me. If you compare, for example, Psalm 14 and Psalm 53, you'll find that they are nearly identical. We see here, for example, in Psalm 14, the fool says in his heart, there is no Yahweh. In Psalm 53, it says, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. And so Yahweh has been updated to Elohim. Another example, in Psalm 14, it says, Yahweh looks down from heaven upon the children of humankind. In Psalm 53, it says, Elohim looks down. Okay, so once again, the divine name has been substituted. In the third example, we see an example of a verb that has been updated. In the fourth example, that comes from verses 4 and 5 in Psalm 14, compared to 4 and 5 in Psalm 53, we see that this section has been expanded theologically. And finally, in verse 7, we see that the divine name, once again, has been changed. And so what we find when we compare Psalm 14 and Psalm 53 is evidence of a text that was updated from an earlier form of Hebrew into a later form of Hebrew. So then the big question becomes, might this have also happened in the case of Kohelet? The problem is that there is in fact no evidence that this has happened. There are no earlier forms of something similar to Kohelet and then later updated versions of Kohelet. The only version of Kohelet that we have is the late Hebrew form. Every manuscript of Kohelet that has ever been discovered matches the Hebrew style of the 3rd or 4th century before Christ. So let's talk about what examples of manuscripts and texts we have of this book, Kohelet. The oldest copies that we have are not actually copies, they're just fragments of the book that were found at Qumran as part of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the oldest actual copy that we have of the Masoretic text is the Leningrad Codex, which dates from about 1000 AD. So what happens when we compare the fragments that we have from Qumran with the full text that we have from the Leningrad Codex? Is there any indication that maybe those fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls give us clues of an earlier form of Kohelet? So I asked ChatGPT, are there any hints that the version of Kohelet found at Qumran reflects an earlier form of Hebrew. And this is the response that I received. By analyzing the fragments side by side with the Masoretic text, it becomes clear that A, the Qumran manuscripts confirm that Kohelet was circulating in a form very close to the Masoretic text in the mid-2nd century before Christ. And the fragments from Qumran do not show an earlier Hebrew stage without Aramisms. So what this tells me then is that Qumran provides no evidence of an earlier Hebrew version of this text. It appears that when Kohelet was first written, the author was in fact writing in a late form of Hebrew. But I'm still not done yet. I have one more line of inquiry. There is a translation of Kohelet into Greek that is known as the Septuagint. This translation was made right around the 2nd century before Christ. So I can imagine some guy in 190 BC who has a Hebrew version of Kohelet, and he is going to translate that into Greek. Now, if he has a really, really old version of Kohelet, let's just imagine he has a copy of Kohelet that is written in the Hebrew of the 10th century BC, we would then imagine that that earlier version of Hebrew would be reflected in the way he translates the text into Greek. So I want to know, does the Septuagint give me any clues that it's a translation based on an earlier form of Hebrew? So I asked ChatGPT, does the Septuagint translation of Kohelet give any indication that it may have been based on a text that differs from the Masoretic text, an older version? And this is what it showed me. First of all, the Septuagint version of Kohelet closely follows the Masoretic text. There is no evidence of large sections missing or added. That the differences between the Septuagint version, the Greek version of Kohelet, and the Hebrew from the Masoretic text tend to be in details of wording and interpretation, not in major content. And therefore, most scholars believe that the translator, the person who translated the Hebrew version of Kohelet into the Greek that now forms part of the Septuagint, was in fact working from a Hebrew text that is essentially the same as the Masoretic text, essentially the same as the Hebrew text that we use for translations of Kohelet today. And then ChatGPT showed me various examples from the text showing that even though the Septuagint is a translation into Greek, it very closely matches the Hebrew of the Masoretic late Hebrew text. There are small differences, but these reflect interpretive smoothing rather than evidence of an older form of Hebrew. So here we see that we have examples from chapter 2, from chapter 4, from chapter 7, from chapter 9, and chapter 12. ChatGPT shows me what the Masoretic text of the Hebrew looks like. It shows me what the Septuagint translation looks like. It gives me a literal English translation, and then it explains what types of differences that we're looking at. And so the conclusion is that this is primarily about interpretive smoothing. And there is in fact no indication that the Septuagint is based on an older version of the book of Kohelet. So let's summarize what we've concluded regarding this second question: how can linguistic analysis help determine when a text was written? What we've seen is that in the case of Kohelet, the style of Hebrew in which the book was written matches the way Hebrew was being written around the 3rd century before Christ. This is a style of Hebrew that is very different from the way Hebrew was written in the 10th century before Christ, which was when Solomon lived. The second conclusion we've drawn is that whereas it is technically possible that our current text, the Masoretic version, reflects a later updated version of an earlier form of Hebrew, there is in fact no evidence that this has happened. There are not multiple versions that reflect a history of revisions. The Dead Sea Scrolls confirm a high level of similarity between the Hebrew version of this text in the 2nd century before Christ and what we find in the Masoretic text. And finally, the Greek translation, the Septuagint, that corresponds to the 2nd century before Christ, gives no indication that it was based on an older form of Hebrew. All the evidence seems to point to a date of authorship around the 3rd century before Christ. And this then leads us to the third and final question. If this book was not in fact written by King Solomon, does that mean that the author was trying to trick the readers? Is it a forgery? Now, I need to confess here that I am an evangelical Christian. I see the Bible as God's Word. And so this possibility that the book of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, was not in fact written by King Solomon rattles me a little bit. Have we all been deceived? So I asked ChatGPT, if the author of Kohelet wanted to give the impression that he was Solomon, isn't that deception or even forgery? Now, here's the summary of the answer that I got. First of all, ChatGPT notes that Kohelet is not a forgery in the sense of deliberate trickery. It is an example of what is called pseudonymous authorship or literary role-playing. The author used the name of Solomon in a rhetorical sense, not as a means of deception. And in support of this argument, ChatGPT laid out 3 points of support. First of all, it noted that writing with a pseudonym was common in the ancient world. In Jewish and Greco-Roman literature, it was in fact common to attribute writings to great figures of the past. And this was not seen as fraud. This was viewed as a way of placing one's teaching in a respected tradition and borrowing from its symbolic authority. So the readers would have known this, living in the 3rd or the 4th century before Christ, when the book of Kohelet appeared. No one would have seen this as a long-lost writing of King Solomon. They would have known that it was written in their time. The second point that ChatGPT laid out is that this book is written in a literary persona. Ancient audiences were used to wisdom literature in the voice of Solomon. And so presenting a work under Solomon's name would not have been perceived as a criminal forgery, but again, as a recognized literary convention. And the final point that ChatGPT laid out is that there is a difference between ancient and modern judgments. Modern readers, shaped by post-Enlightenment ideas of historical accuracy and intellectual property, might call this deceptive, but ancient readers likely saw it as a didactic device, much like a playwright scripting a speech for a famous character. That's why rabbis debated Kohelet's theology, not because of its authenticity in a modern sense. They accepted the persona as part of the genre. The debate around Kohelet among the rabbis was really around its theological content. And even if they didn't all believe that it was written by Solomon, they ultimately agreed that it would be part of the Hebrew canon because its theology aligned with the theology of the Old Testament corpus. Now, personally, I can live with that answer. So let's summarize what we've done today. First, we asked ChatGPT, why is there a debate around the authorship of Kohelet? Second, we asked, how can linguistic analysis help me determine when a text was written? And finally, we asked, if this book wasn't written by Solomon, was the author trying to deceive the readers? Now, the advice that I would give to anybody seriously interested in this question is, don't just rely on what you find in ChatGPT. AI generators like this can only scan, analyze, and synthesize the information that is available on the web. They are not original sources of information. So in this case, if we really want to do solid academic research, we have to go to the scholars who gave us the information upon which the ChatGPT answers are based. Now, the good news is that ChatGPT is very happy to point you to those very scholars. So I went on, this was my final question, and I typed, I want to study the authorship of Kohelet for myself. Can you recommend 5 academic resources to help me do this? And so we see here that ChatGPT gave me some excellent recommendations. Tremper Longman, Michael Fox, Chun-Young Seo, James Crenshaw, Norbert Lofink, and then it also pointed me to some very academic works with a linguistic focus written by Avi Hurwitz and Gary Rensburg. So once again, we see that if you really want authoritative academic research, go to the academic sources. But I think you would agree with me that ChatGPT was extremely helpful in helping me research a very difficult question. And that's it for this session. I hope that you have found this tutorial helpful.